Good afternoon, everyone. It's Whiskey Wednesday, July 1st, 2020. It's also Canada Day, so happy Canada Day to our friends north of the 49th parallel. Wish we could be with you up there because Canada is one of my favorite places to go to. I always, before the pandemic, I used to get up there several times a year for various whiskey festivals and stuff, and hopefully we'll be able to all get back together again soon sometime. Hope you've had a good week so far. We're heading into the holiday weekend here in the U.S., and we will have the happy hour show on Friday night. Just to give you a heads up, the one and only Robin Lang, the bard of Scotch Whisky, will be on the show with us on Friday night, along with Richard Woodard, formerly of ScotchWhisky.com, for our weekly Writers Roundtable. But we have whiskey makers on the show tonight, as usual on Wednesdays. Hopefully, George Grant from Glenfarclas will be able to join us soon. He is having some technical problems thanks to storms in the Speyside area right now that are keeping him from connecting in, but hopefully we will have him joining us. But we also have Kirstie McCallum from Glen Moray and Rebecca Jago from the Last Drop Distillers joining us. And welcome to the Webcast. How are you tonight?
Yeah, great, thanks. Yep, happy to join you.
Rebecca, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the show.
So I guess we should start out while folks are sending in their comments and questions. And just to let you know, you can do that if you're watching us on Facebook, YouTube, or on Periscope. Just throw a comment in there and we'll see it. If you're watching us on Twitter, we will not see your replies to the tweet with the live video in it until after the webcast is over. So please switch to one of the other mediums if you want to send in your comments or your questions. We'll be talking a little bit about whiskeys, finding rare casks, luxury whiskeys, rebuilding whiskey brands, things, all sorts of fun stuff over the next hour or so. Once again, we're hoping that George will be able to rejoin us soon, but we sort of always start out with what's in your glasses. And Rebecca, let's start with you.
So I did ask earlier on Instagram for people to tell me what they thought I should drink. I'm in the very fortunate position of having quite a lot of samples at home because obviously working from home. But I finally plumped for the 56-year-old Last Drop blended Scotch whisky. This is a sample bottle. Our oldest ever blend. I felt that sitting alongside currently one, but perhaps two single malt specialists, it was the moment to drink a blend. So Sanjava.
Kirstie, what's in your glass?
In my glass is Glen Moray, and it's the one of the Glen Moray Classic range. It's the Glen Moray Portwood finish.
Lovely.
Nice. I've always liked that one. And if you missed last week's show, we had Graham Cool, who was the distillery manager at Glen Moray for many years on, and he's now enjoying life in Dingle, Ireland, as the manager at Dingle Distillery. So you can catch that in the archives. Since it is Canada Day, and our good pal Davin de Kergamo a few years ago got to pick a hand-selected barrel of Crown Royal and sent me a bottle of it. And I decided to pour a glass of that tonight to honor my friends in Canada. So, Slan Siobhan, enjoy it. And we'll look forward to getting all of your questions in. Kirstie, let's start off with you, since you just took over at Glen Moray and also with the La Martiniquaise blends, Level 5, Cutty Sark, Sir Edwards. Tell us how things have been going in the new job so far. It's only been a few months, right?
Yeah, 9 months to count it. Absolutely hectic, really hectic. Fantastic place, great people, lots and lots of casks to look at. Our warehousing at Bathgate has 750,000 casks in it. Glen Moray has 100,000, so there's lots of whiskey to go and find and check out at the moment. So it's been great. I've not been able to get up to Glen Moray as much as I'd like to, but hopefully it'll open up and I can get up there and start investigating even more casks.
How do you make that adjustment when you go to a new company and you've got to be responsible for all those casks? Obviously, you're not going to sample every single one of them for that first year, are you, right?
Hopefully not. I would like to try. Basically, what will happen is I will look at the inventory and select parcels and look at a couple of casks from each of those parcels rather than look at every single cask. I also, a lot of my fun is actually going in and looking for the unusual ones. So I have to say that was the first thing I did, was go into inventory and say, "Oh, is there anything I can try?" I've been like a kid in a sweet shop since I started at the distillery, trying to find all the unusual casks lying in the warehouse.
That sweet shop reference is the same one Rachel Berry made a couple of weeks ago. I think you guys kind of like that that concept of being in the sweet shop when you're going through the warehouses, right?
Oh yeah, it's definitely. It's like when you were a kid, you walked into the sweet shop and there's all these jars of different colours and different sweeties. In a warehouse, it's barrels full of different whiskies. It's fantastic.
How long does it take you to put your own stamp on the place once you arrive at a new company as the whiskey maker and head of whiskey creation?
I would say probably a couple of years at least, until things that you have laid down yourself start to come through. At the moment, I'm looking at historical casks that have been laid down by Graham or even Graham's predecessors before that, and picking when they're ready to bottle. Hopefully the next year or so, you'll start to see a few expressions coming through that I've actually laid the cask down for.
Rebecca, let's bring you into this discussion.
Sure.
You get these blends like your 56-year-old.
Yeah.
You didn't blend these. These came pre-blended, and then somebody put them into casks and let that blend marry for a long time, right?
A long time. And in fact, I mean, that's where the whole business started, was with James and my dad going to Scotland and of very old blended Scotch whisky, and that was the 1960, which was the first release from the last drop, and that was just another one of those fortunate accidents, if you like. Nobody, I think it's not that nobody knew the barrels were there, but nobody knew just how special the liquid inside was. And the lovely thing about very old blends is the time that they've spent, like a very old marriage, if you like, where they've just had 25 or 40, or in the case of the one I'm drinking tonight, 56 years to get to know each other, and you get this extraordinary alchemy, which I'm sure Kirstie knows more about the science of than I do, of just coming together in a way that finishing doesn't do. So what we are still bottling at the moment is existing blends that have been finishing in either bourbon wood or sherry wood, or both in the case of the 56, and bottling them. But certainly the future will lead us to a point where we will start to create our own blends, not necessarily of young make, but of older casks that we think for a huge number of reasons would benefit from marriage themselves. I feel like a matchmaker now.
One of the fun things you've also done is do some cognacs too. I remember tasting you in New York a year or so ago that was just absolutely stunning. Where do you guys find all these casks, and are there still some out there that you haven't been able to get your hands on yet that you know about?
Well, so, I mean, I'm sorry, if I talk for too long, Mark, you just have to stop me, because this is one of my favorite subjects. The cognac that you tasted when we were in New York is possibly my favorite of all our releases, just because of the romance of how it was found and how it was made. This is a cognac, Kirstie, that was distilled in 1925 at a small family distillery by the grandfather of the guy who is now the distillery manager and owner there. And between the wars, this single barrel of cognac from 1925 was actually hidden behind a false wall at the distillery to prevent the advancing Germans from finding it. And then his grandson in 2008, late 2018, was renovating a barn and found this single barrel of cognac from 90-something years ago, and also a barrel of something else, which I can't really talk about, which we'll be finding out about later this year, not a cognac. And we tasted this. So cognac, as of course you'll know, is a bit like a lot of Scotch, most often blended. Single vineyard, single estate cognacs are very unusual. There is not the same premium put on single estate cognacs as there is on single malts. But this one was just, I mean, wonderful story, very romantic, but also just spectacularly delicious cognac that entirely untouched. No one had topped up the cask. There was just enough for just under 200 bottles. Really supremely delicious. So But with the last drop, because we are not a Scotch whisky company solely, this started very early on, because I mentioned the first release was the 1960 blended Scotch. Their second release, when neither my dad nor James really had much idea what they were doing, to be frank, they both worked for giant businesses. They'd never run a small company themselves. Someone said, "What are you doing next?" And my dad said, well, he used to work for Hennessy, "I'll go and see what they've got in cognac." So immediately, instead of being an independent bottler of Scotch whisky, we became, by default, a bottler of spirits. And since then, there have been several cognacs, and they are very much part of the history and DNA of the business, and a magical spirit to discover.
There are some really good Armagnacs out there too that I imagine you could probably discover if you look far enough, because there's some really old Armagnacs that are still at a reasonable price.
There really are. I think Armagnac is very interesting. We actually have a place down in the southwest of France, so deep into Gascony and the Three Musketeers country. The problem comes with provenance. Armagnac is the real Wild West, frankly. You don't have anything like the paper trails that you'll get in Scotland or in cognac. We don't honestly know. A lot of it, you just don't know whether it's what it says it was. I was once offered a parcel of cognac that miraculously was several thousand litres of 1888 Armagnac. And you sort of think maybe it wasn't what it said it was. And 1888, which is obviously a very, very lucky number for the Chinese, and this huge lake of the stuff possibly wasn't what it said it was. So you do need to be quite careful when even if what I trade in is telling stories, you still need to be fairly sure that they're true.
Well, I know I was at the first time I tried Armagnacs several years ago with Paul Packolt in New York. They pulled out a bottle of 1897 Armagnac, which was obviously distilled in 1897, but had been in glass for a long time, because they still don't. They still count it from when it was distilled, even though it's in glass. So that could be part of that too, I would think.
I think that's true, and I think Kirstie's probably got much more to say about the science of aging spirits, than I have, and I'd much rather you spoke about that. But it is an interesting fact that a 12-year-old is always a 12-year-old, no matter how many years ago it was put into glass.
Right. Well, we have a question coming in. I'm sorry, Kirstie, go ahead. You were about to say something.
Yeah, it's true. Once it's in the glass, there's not a lot of interact. You've not got the oak there to interact with, so you're not getting any more development of flavours, really.
Well, we have a question for you, Kirstie, from Tyrone Coty in Nova Scotia. Any chance we might see another special edition Cutty Sark Tam O'Shanter? That was such a delicious dram, Tyrone says, and I would second that. Tell me about your plans for Cutty Sark now that La Martiniquaise acquired that brand recently.
Okay. Right, at the moment in Cutty Sark, we're doing quite a bit of work on the brand, and at the moment I'm looking at brand extensions, looking at aged expressions for Cutty Sark, and that's one I might actually have a look into, since people seem to like it so much.
How else do you expand that brand? What else do you do to try to revive it? Because Cutty Sark is one of those brands that's been great for a long time, or historic, and the whiskey was always good, but it just didn't get the sales.
Yeah. I think what we need to do is basically rejuvenate it. We want to keep Cutty Sark. We want to keep the whole emphasis of Cutty Sark on the story of it, the spirit of adventure. Basically, Cutty Sark is a whiskey that for people to experiment with. It's kind of really easy to drink. There's nothing standing out. There's all moulded flavours. It's very mixable. You can do it in cocktails. You can do whatever you want with it. And the whole thing for Cutty Sark for me is to get people involved, to bring young people into the category and get people drinking it. Drink it how you like. No matter, there should be no this, that, do this, do that, do the next thing. However anybody wants to drink it, they drink it. And I think Cutty Sark moulds itself very well to that kind of thing.
Interestingly, you probably know this, Mark, is that Sazerac's business 375 Park has just taken on the distribution for Cutty Sark in the US. So I expect to see great things happening there. So I think it's a wonderful whiskey, by the way.
Thank you.
And,
it's a great brand.
And 375 Park Avenue, since Last Drop is also now part of Sazerac, they handle your whiskeys as well in the States, right?
They do.
And that's really sort of helped out, because I know in the early days of Last Drop, you guys were working with a number of importers in the U.S. at times, right? And it was before the deal with Sazerac in 2016.
Yeah.
It's provided some stability, right?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I think without harking back to the beginnings too much, when James particularly, and my dad was 82 when they started the business, so he didn't do a lot of traveling, but when James was traveling the world trying to find distributors wherever he could, it was a very much a sort of hand-to-mouth existence. And we did settle on a distributor in the US, but in fact, the conversation with Sazerac started as a conversation about distribution before the decision was made to actually acquire the brand altogether. And it has given us, so as you say, so much stability, so much exposure to a much more cohesive group of sales team, a much more integrated company, and their passion from the very top, from Mark Brown downwards, for the brand has been an absolute revelation for us, honestly.
And it also gives you access to their science, their barrels, their labs, their distribution network, a little of everything that a little small company doesn't always have access to.
Yeah, and indeed, you know, a couple of years ago, we were able to release, admittedly, one of our smallest ever releases, but we were able to release an old bourbon from Buffalo Trace, which was an amazing thing to be able to do, to expand the range of spirits we offer again. And where we're going to be doing something similar later this year, so watch this space.
We have a comment from Suzanne Grant. Hi, Kirstie. Met you several times at Deanston. A big job to do at Glen Moray. Joining you with one of my favorite distilleries, Bunnahabhain Madeira finished the festival bottling.
That was this year's festival bottling, I believe.
I think so.
Yeah, that's a beautiful spirit. I was so happy to see that go into bottle. It really is a gorgeous dram.
And Bill Ricker points out, glad to hear Cutty's getting a revival. He also likes the Prohibition. Haven't found the existing older expressions around here, and he lives up in the Boston area. There aren't many older expressions of Cutty Sark anymore, are there?
Not at the moment, no. They've not been about for the last few years. Prohibition was the main one you'll see out there. There was also Storm for a little while, one of the other expressions, but not the aged expressions. We are hoping to come back with a few aged expressions in the next year or so.
And Graham Fraser in the UK asks, was Cutty Sark not a former United Distillers brand? Seems to remember it formerly contained Glen Esk or Hillside. I think that brand's gone through a bunch of hands over the years.
Yeah, the ones I know that's been known are Edrington. I am not sure who owned it before Edrington.
And Ben Marnock points out it belongs to Berry Brothers and Rudd, probably. They were the ones who found it.
Wow. Yeah.
We also have a question for you, Rebecca. Let me scroll up here and get to it. From Greg Serafian in Paris. How do you manage to keep very old whiskeys from falling below that 40% ABV limit when you have them in casks?
I don't think that's just our problem. I think that's a problem for quite a lot of people. And I'm sure Kirstie nodding along with that one, especially when you've got a significantly large maturing inventory. And I'm sure yours, Kirstie, is 1,000 times larger than ours. What we do is a monitoring program. It's all you can do. Keep them in good condition and in good conditions as well. We noticed that at one of the warehouses where we keep stock, one of their smaller warehouses seemed to have its own microclimate, and things were maturing much, much faster and evaporating. In fact, the 1970 mark that you were tasting earlier, one of those casks lost 20% in a year. And we think that, I know, I mean, obviously there was very little left in the barrel anyway, but I think you just need to keep a really careful eye on it. And if things start to drop below about 40-something%, you have to take action, whether it's re-racking or marrying casks together. I think it's a really It's a constant challenge. I think the other thing I've only just really been learning about recently is that Korea has a significant market for under-strength whiskies. Do you know about this, Kirstie?
Yes, yeah.
I'm wondering if there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, it's spirit drinks. Yes.
That's right. Sorry, not all whiskies.
They'll pay high prices for them. And we were
Not
talking.
our prices, I don't think.
I'm sorry, what?
Not our prices, I don't think.
Yeah, we weren't going to talk about that. Whiskeys are wonderful, but damn, they're expensive.
Man, they are expensive. Special occasions only, I think.
And Charles Epperson had a question. We sort of talked about this. How do you refresh an old brand like Cutty Sark? Because Charles can't remember when he asked for or overheard somebody else specifically ask for a Cutty Sark.
Yeah.
What's your process over the next couple of years to bring that brand back to life?
Basically, liquid on lips, get people tasting it again, get people realising how good a brand it is. Also, a lot of PR, marketing, and just making sure it's a damn good blend and that people want to drink it. That's basically it.
And Bill Ricker points out that back in the Berry Brothers and Rudd days, Cutty Sark was presumed to have Glenrothes and Bunnahabhain malts because Berry Brothers and Rudd had interests in both distilleries, but we'll never know, of course. Tom Smith asks, he's fairly new to Glen Moray and wants to know if the special finish barrels or barrel finishes will be forthcoming, like a Cabernet, a Port, and a Chardonnay. And he apologizes if we already discussed this in the first couple of minutes. Well, we didn't. So what can we expect to see from Glen Moray?
Well, Glen Moray at the moment, we have actually just released, it was a special edition for the UK market. It was a Madeira matured Glen Moray 2006. So that's out there at the moment. We are looking to extend that programme because up until now, I think Glen Moray has been very underrated. A lot of places have seen Glen Moray as a kind of supermarket malt. It's lower price, good quality spirit for what you get, accessible, lower price sort of idea. But actually, Glen Moray is absolutely fantastic. It's some beautiful, beautiful flavours in it. And I'm hoping in the next year or so to release quite a few expressions that are just going to show Glen Moray up for all its glory. We also want to try and extend what we have as classic range, which is the Chardonnay finish, the Port finish, because I think it's a really nice thing to bring people into whiskey, and I'll let them start to experiment with whiskies that are accessible and easy to drink and affordable as well, rather than spending, say, £60 or whatever on a bottle of whiskey. It's something that's affordable and easy to drink. So I want Glen Moray to be available for everybody. I want it to be an accessible whiskey, that there's something for newcomers, there's something for people just wanting a whiskey at night, and there's something for the whiskey enthusiasts as well.
So how do you decide who gets to make the decision on releases? Do you make that call as the whiskey maker? Does the marketing department get to say, you get 5 releases this year, make them fit this portfolio? Who gets to make that call?
Who has to have that argument, you mean? It's a bit of to and fro between myself and marketing. Marketing will have a say, I'll have a say. We have discussions if the says don't go particularly in the right direction, and we'll come to an agreement at some point.
If you need a tiebreaker, just call me. I'll argue in your favor every time.
Thank you.
And Tom Smith wants to know when that Madeira is coming to the U.S., or is it coming to the U.S.?
No, it's not coming to the US. It's a UK exclusive only, but it can be purchased through the specialists in the UK or through the distillery itself.
And that's a part of a whole new series that, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, the Curiosity range, yes. We've had the cider cask, which SWA took a little bit of exception to. We had the Wrong Agricole cask, and this year it's a Madeira cask. But the reason it's a curiosity is Madeira is usually used for a finish, but this has been used for its full maturation right through.
We also have Seth Claskin wishing our friend Monique Houston a belated happy birthday. Dave Kuhn asks, for a company like The Last Drop, what's the balance between age/rarity and taste? There are people who will buy whiskey just because it's rare. How often do you reject something that isn't quite right, though, in terms of taste?
That's it's one of the most interesting questions, and also one of the most often asked. And I think it's actually at the heart of what we're doing. We estimate that we don't bottle about 95% of what we're offered. And obviously, what we go out and try and find and what people come to us with comprises that 100%, if you like. If the rule of thumb, and because I'm not an expert and would never claim to be, and in fact, James and Tom were not like you, Kirstie, they were not professional whiskey makers or tasters. My dad had an absolute passion for Scotch and he drank it every single day of his adult life. But they were really marketeers and ideas men. So the basic principle on which the business was founded was, if it's not absolutely delicious, we're not going to put it in a bottle. And that overrides anything about whether it's single malt, single grain, blended Scotch, cognac, rum, bourbon. If it doesn't taste good, it has no place in the bottle, because rarity isn't enough, age isn't enough. It's got to be delicious, but it's also got to be delicious to the layman. And I think this comes back to a point you were making, Kirstie, about Cutty Sark, which is you want people to drink it. You don't want people to look at their bottle and revere it. You want, no matter what price point you're sitting at, you want people to pick up their bottle, whether it's a miniature or a full-size bottle, and say, this is just wonderful stuff. And I, as the guy at home or the girl at home, I know that I'm enjoying what I'm drinking and that it's a supreme pleasure. So I think pleasure and just obvious deliciousness is actually the most important criterion of all. And that then makes it easy for me to say, yes, this is good enough. Because if I don't like it, then it's not good enough.
Graham,
totally agree.
Go ahead, Kirstie. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I said totally agree. It shouldn't be about how it looks or how expensive it's going to be in the bottle. It's about how it tastes. Absolutely.
And I think I can handle this question from Graham Fraser, who says he sees so many versions of Glen Moray Classic available at low prices. That's great, but does it not diminish the brand reputation? But let me presume to say here that with that range, because there are so many different finishes on that, there's a flavor out there for everybody. And if you just had one low price generic version of Glen Moray in the classic range and then put all the barrel finishes into the more expensive ones, you might turn some consumers off. But this way, there's a Glen Moray for everyone. Is that fair to say, Kirstie?
That's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to make whiskey easy for people to come into. We have what we call the classic range with all these finishes to allow people to try them. We then have the heritage range, which is the older whiskies with the age statements on them. Again, different casks. And then we'll have limited editions and curio. We just want to try and show what whiskey can do for everybody. There is a whiskey out there for everybody. And I think it gets difficult for people sometimes to go and spend 40, 50, 60 pounds in a bottle when we can make something that is accessible, is easy to drink, that's nice to drink, and lets people into the category at a reasonable price.
And as our pal Ian MacArthur from Lagavulin says, whiskey's meant for drinking, as Dave points out. Question answered in an instance from Pete Head. We appreciate that. And I don't know about this one, but Graham says he seems to remember seeing a Cutty Sark advert on the old Glen Esk distillery before it closed. That might be your memory. I got to admit, I wasn't over in Scotland before they tore Glen Esk down, so I'm not 100% sure about that one. Seth Glaskin, and we should point out Seth is with Single Cask Nation, absolutely loves Glen Moray. Single Cask Nation released some excellent expressions of single cask Glen Morays with varied wine cask finishes. And that's really sort of, I think, I'm beginning to wonder if we've pretty much exhausted the wine cask finishes. I don't know if there's many more wine varieties out there that we can play with.
I've got a few experiments ongoing at the moment. I'm not going to go too much into depth with them. Sometimes it might not be like actually a whole new wine expression or a new type of wine. It might just be that whiskey with that wine, because it's not just the wine, it's about how the whiskey interacts as well. Because you've got some whiskies that work very well with it, or you've got other whiskies that don't work very well with it. So I think there's still a little bit of mileage in the wine finishes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only one I've found that I really didn't think worked at all well was a Banyuls wine finish. That one came from a distillery in central Scotland that shall remain unnamed to protect the guilty, and I was not impressed with that one at all.
I
Why
have
was
seen
that,
Banyuls.
Mark?
I'm sorry, what?
Why was that, Mark? What didn't work for you?
It just tasted off. It just the whiskey. When I taste a whiskey that's been finished, I still want to taste. I want the essence of the wine finish or whatever spirit it's finished in, but I don't want it to overpower it. In this case, the Banyuls overpowered.
Okay.
But that could actually be a case of the cask being left too long as well, that it's not they've not got it at the actual maximum of where they're going to get the interaction and the flavours.
Dave Kuhn points out, and we should have Adam Hett here for this, his favorite dram all time, an 11-year-old Port Charlotte matured in a Vin de Naturel cask. And nice. There is something to be said for the Solera system, as Ben Marnock points out. Of course, how many Scottish distilleries are using the Soleras? I know Glenfiddich does with its 15-year-old, but we don't see as many Soleras in Scotland as I think we could probably get away with in some cases. What do you think about that, Kirstie?
Yeah, there are places that use you wouldn't really call them full Solera systems, but there are places who use the same kind of system where we're continually topping up on the same liquid so we get consistency going forward. It means that you're not always making new batches. You keep the character going right through the batches. It might not be what you think of as a full traditional Solera system, but it's the same kind of idea.
Rebecca, I want you to tell us about the blend that you guys made that none of us can buy. You had a bottle of it there, and it was one of your picks, Tom's blend.
Oh, yes. So, as you may or may not know, well, I'm sure you both know that we are very much in the business of ultra premium, super rare and exclusive bottlings. And that has meant that when we do events, when we serve to our customers, we have to be very, very sparing in what we're putting into people's glasses. And in about 2018, we were celebrating our 10th anniversary, and one of the things we were trying to figure out was how to be more generous with the spirited events without serving competitor brands. So sorry, 1 second. Sorry. So my dad and James were obviously super involved with things like Johnny Walker.
Oh, wait a second. We got to know what happened just then. We got to know what was going on.
Okay, my husband was boiling the kettle, and I know that the kettle is really noisy, and all you were going to hear was the sound of a kettle boiling. So I was giving him a bit of an evil eye there.
Okay, we couldn't hear a thing.
He's now taken the whole kettle out of the kitchen.
No, please continue.
So Beanie, James's daughter, and I decided that we needed to come up with a way of being generous of spirit, which is very much at the heart of who we are and what we do, without saying, oh, yes, you know, my dad and Beanie's dad were involved with the development of Chivas 18 or Johnny Walker Blue Label, so let's serve it. It just becomes a slightly tenuous link. So we decided that what we needed was our house blend. That was something that was younger and more not affordable, but less rare than the very limited bottlings that we bottle under the Last Drop name. And eventually the idea was that we would create our own, or have created our own house blend that was, in this case, this is an 18-year-old. Sorry, I'm not very good at the camera management. That we had created for us by Ian McLeod Distillers. It's a limited edition. We only ever had 1,000 bottles made. And it was very much created in the image of what my father liked to drink in the Scotch. So that's why it's called Tom's Blend No. 1. He worked with Charlie McLean and the team at Ian McLeod to create a whiskey that was effectively the summary of what my dad in his later life liked to drink. 18 years old, preponderance of Speyside whiskies, quite, as you'll see from the colour, quite a sherried finish. And it's a very nice, very drinkable whiskey, but its rarity comes, as you rightly pointed out, Mark, from the fact that you can't buy it. So you can drink it at events, you can drink it if you're given a bottle, but you can't. There's never been a bottle for sale except, in fact, recently at the auction that the Worshipful Company of Distillers carried out to benefit the Drinks Charity Trust in the UK during the current coronavirus pandemic. But we've never sold a bottle for money to anybody. So it has a different sort of, but equally compelling rarity. And I didn't open it tonight, but I do drink it fairly often. And my dad was beyond thrilled and touched by the fact that it's called Tom's Blend, and that not only that, but he had a lifetime supply. And just a very sweet little story is that our office used to be in Putney, which is in southwest London, and my father lived about 5 minutes walk from the office, which was very special for me because I could go and see him so often. But he used to ring up one of the team members sort of every couple of weeks and say, would it be okay if I had another delivery, please? And somebody would walk down the road with a couple of bottles to keep him going.
That reminds me sort of what George Grant told me about Glenfarclas 105 and his grandfather. Many years ago, he was getting the same deliveries from the distillery, and then he was double dipping or something, as I think the story was. He would get some delivered to him, and then he would just go down and pick them up, and so he would always have a little bit more. And I do need to point out, because Michelle Sharp says, was George Grant to be today? George emailed about half hour before the show started and said that there were severe thunderstorms in his area that were playing havoc with the phone lines and the internet connections, and that he would try to join us, but he was having trouble connecting in. So clearly it's 40 minutes into the show. We're not going to have George today. We will try to get him scheduled in for next week or very soon and try to get him back on the show. Michael Gowan says, I enjoy Glen Moray expressions very much, and I love that at their price point, I never have to be concerned about replacing a bottle. What new expressions to the classic range are coming to the U.S. market?
Well, there are actually quite a few expressions of the classic range that are only available in different markets. So you might see a few spreading in from there. I'm working at the moment on the classic range as well. So watch this space and you'll see what might appear.
I've heard that line so many times. The watch.
I'm definitely working on it. There will be something.
Dave Kuhn asks, people like to speak of things like Longmorn as the blender's malt. Do you have favorite malts to use as foundations for blends? And enter the obligatory John Glazer Kleinlich joke here. Because we all know that John Glazer at Compass Box is, and the running joke is, John's incapable of making a blend unless it has at least 1% Kleinlich in it.
There are definitely stable malts that you will use. I have my own selection of malts that I like to use. There's ones that make a good backbone on a whiskey. There's ones that will add certain characteristics to it. So yeah, I definitely have a list of favorite malts I will try to use if I possibly can in a blend.
Such as?
I love Mortlach. I'm also a massive fan of Bunnahabhain. Bunnahabhain's a great whiskey for a blend. I like a lot of Speysides. I like Glentochers. There's just all sorts of whiskies that are really good at just moulding things together. Teenage. So many of them.
Well, explain the classifications, because I know there's Class A blending malts, Class B, Class C, sort of among the distillery community within the blending world. Explain the classifications.
The classifications tend to be the kind of whiskies that are what we call the ones you want to use as the main characters or the subnotes and things like that. I don't tend to use the classifications at all when I'm blending. I will just use basically what I have and what I can put together to put the blend into play.
So
it's also
go ahead.
Sorry, it's also as well you'd use it for, as you know, sometimes we have to substitute in blends as well if something isn't available, or so you'd use that kind of classification for you deciding what you're going to supplement in there as well.
And Dave says, for the record, I am a big fan of Compass Box if the glaze is listening. I have never heard John Glazer referred to as that before. We're going to be in trouble for this one. And Bill Ricker says, Bunnahabhain, Mortlach, Kleinleash, and Longmorn are all good ones for blending. I know Mortlach has always been one of those that's been a favorite among blenders just because of the meatiness. But when you talk about Bunnahabhain, it's a lot of folks would think, okay, an Islay malt, but Bunnahabhain's not heavily peated, and that's the difference, right?
Yeah, Bunnahabhain makes a really good whiskey for moulding whiskies together. It really gives a great backbone to a blend. And as you say, the majority of Bunnahabhain isn't. We do peated stuff, but the majority of Bunnahabhain isn't peated.
You left before the big renovation really got going at Bunnahabhain. What's going to be the fun there when that distillery gets back up and running full steam again? Same thing with Tobermory. It's just now getting back up and running. And I know you were instrumental in reviving the whole Tobermory range. Yeah.
Hopefully it'll go from strength to strength. I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of the distillery.
And Graham Fraser points out that Richard Patterson's book, Goodness Knows, has some fascinating history of whiskey blending categories. Dave Kuhn, Longmorn is just good for drinking. Give me that old green 16-year-old bottle. Chris Ratcliffe in the UK has a question for you, Rebecca. Does the last drop have a style, and how would you describe it? Is there a style that describes a last drop whiskey?
So I think the short answer is no, because at the moment what we are doing is finding and bottling single barrels or barrels of old blends. So it's a question of finding what we think is truly delicious. And as you Mark certainly will know, we've bottled everything from heavily sherried blends to the Glenrothes you've just tasted, which are all from ex-bourbon casks. So and we've also made, we have quite a thing for single grains. So we're across all the three principal categories of Scotch whisky with no predilection for any one of them. So I think the answer is no, we don't. If there's a hallmark, it's that we are extremely proud of what we put in the bottle, and that we, as I said earlier, think it is truly delicious. I hope that in the future there will be a small part of what we do will have, if you like, hallmarks or a sense of who we are, but that will come when we start to blend and to create, I suppose, in the loosest sense of the word, ourselves. At the moment, it's really what we're doing is showcasing the skills of long gone blenders and distillers. And I think, maybe in 50 years time, Kirstie, when we're showcasing, not me personally, an amazing creation from the Glen Moray stable, then it's a sense of respect for what people in the past have done. And of course, with old blends, it's very rare that you even know who blended it, let alone what they blended it from, because this has always been, until indeed, the days of John Glazer, it's always been an absolute secret. Nobody discloses the full recipe of their blend. So it's a way of paying tribute, I think, to master blenders of the past. Is very much part of what we're doing. But the short answer, and that was not a short answer, is no, we don't have a house style.
I think the house style is just plain excellence, because I've never had a bad whiskey out of a last drop bottling yet.
Thanks, Mark.
And that Tom's Blend #1 is one of the best blended whiskeys I've ever tasted, period. It was just that good. Greg asks a question in Paris: how many different distilleries can be found in that 56-year-old last drop at the maximum? Just to give you an idea. I'm betting you don't know, do you?
I don't know. No, what I do know, and of course the wonderful thing about science is that they can give you quite a big steer, is we know that the 56-year-old is over 60% single malts. I think it's fantastic that the labs can actually identify that and say, we can give you a rough breakdown. So we know, and 56 years ago, well, it wasn't blended 56 years ago, but when it was first blended, anything with more than 60% malts was classified as a deluxe blend, which is quite a nice sort of very old-fashioned description. So we know it was a preponderance of single malts in the blend. It's quite rich, and it's had a long time in sherry, followed by an even longer time in bourbon wood. So it's got a very, very rich flavour, a very layered sense to it. But I don't know. I would guess 40 plus whiskies, but that's a guess. I don't know. I know that the original 1960 blend had over 70 different malts and grains in it, but I think that's an exception rather than a rule.
Kirstie, how would you even start to work with 70 different malts? I mean, I know blenders today they think it's outstanding if they get 40 into a blend.
Yes, the 70 is quite exceptional. That would take quite a lot of work to get that to work. Yeah. That's off to them.
I wonder whether it's as much good luck as good judgment when you're playing with 70 plus whiskies.
There must be so many flavours that are all interacting with one another. Yeah, it must be quite it's a difficult task.
Yeah, that has the chance to be just an absolute mess over time.
But I also think...
Go ahead.
I also think that the reason that the 1960 with over 70 different malts and grains was so special was probably as much to do with the time it spent in wood and the length of time it had just sitting maturing as it was to do with the original blend. I mean, Kirstie, you know this far better than I do, is that that time and air and wood are as important as the raw ingredients in creating the final bottling, and that perhaps if you'd bottled it 20 years before, you'd have had a completely different reaction to what was in the glass.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's everything that comes together, and if anything, the wood, the air, the atmosphere, what happens in that cask is, I would say, more important in some ways than what you put in. You've got to have a good spirit to start with, but the maturation and how they act together is actually, I would say, about 60% of what you get in the flavour of your whiskey.
We have a good question here. It was originally intended for Rebecca, but it's good for both of you. Experience with whiskeys older than 18 to 20 years old. Tyrone's a little bit leery of them due to price and possible excess wood influence. I think 18 to 21 for a lot of distilleries is the sweet spot when it comes to before they get to be over oaked and over woody, depending on the distillery. Glen Grant doesn't even start to get really good until it hits 25 to 30 years old, in my opinion. I mean, Glen Grant gets vibrant as it gets older.
Yeah. It does depend on the character of the spirit. It depends on the quality of the wood you've used. There's all sorts of things come into play with that, but there's sometimes some whiskies you will get to 21, 22 and they'll fall off a cliff. They'll become really, really woody and just, what's the point? Other whiskies will just continue to mature absolutely beautifully. We have a 1978 cask of Glen Moray sitting in the warehouse at the moment, and it's a refill hogshead it's in, and the flavour is stunning. Glen Moray's still there for all its glory, and then you've got this beautiful soft oak coming through in the back of it. It really is a stunning blend. So it's a stunning dram. So a lot of it's got to do with the cask and the quality of the spirit you're using in the first place.
And Graham Fraser points out, it seems Scotch blends have fewer and fewer constituent whiskies. Is there a point when quality diminishes as a result? And Rebecca, I should have let you weigh. I didn't give you a chance to weigh in on that same question.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything Kirstie says. I think for super aged whiskies, which is obviously where we are, you need a more minimal influence from the wood. No whiskey is going to survive 70 years in a new or relatively recently used cask, because it is all about the balance between the influence of the wood and the influence of oxygen and the spirit. So obviously you've got the more robust spirits that can stand up to more wood influence. But of course, one of the reasons why the bourbon or the sherry industries and the Scotch industry are so inextricably linked is because of that multiple usage. So that something like those the Glenrothes 1970s that you've just tasted, Mark, the reason they survived for nearly 50 years is because they were in second fill ex-bourbon casks. You put them into, first use bourbon casks or to sherry wood, they're never going to make it to 50 years old. So it's a question of finding that science and understanding what you're hoping to achieve, I suppose. But we've got whiskies sitting in third fill ex-bourbon casks where the wood influence is really minimal. Chuck them into a relatively new sherry cask for 6 months, and it's going to completely change the spirit. And in fact, the third release from the last drop, I don't know if you know this, Mark, but this is quite an interesting little sort of side story, is that the original bottling was the 1960 blend. And my dad and James said, why don't we keep a little bit back and put it into sherry wood and see whether it makes it to 50 years? And because they were almost having fun with a new company, they had no idea what to expect. It was an experiment worth making. And they put a small parcel, like 300 and something bottles worth, back into an ex-sherry cask. That I would challenge anybody on earth to recognize that the spirit that came out at 50 years old from the sherry wood was the same whiskey that had been bottled 3 years before straight out of a bourbon cask, because the impact of wood is so enormous. It's absolutely delicious, and it's one of my real favorites, but it's just a balancing act, I would say, at all times.
And those 3 casks of Glenrothes, those were originally intended for blenders, right? Because we've always thought of Glenrothes in recent times with the single malt bottlings as being heavily sherry influenced. Because except for the Alba Reserve that they released because they wanted to have a bourbon cask version, we never saw any original distillery bottlings from the Glenrothes that weren't in sherry casks. So this makes it even more special when you can try the exact opposite, sort of like back in the days when before the Macallan did the fine oak range, when you couldn't find Macallan in anything that wasn't sherry. And bourbon cask Macallan, it was rare. Yeah.
Oh, very much so. And I think it's a really fascinating exercise is to look at some of the more sherried Glenrothes and taste these really wonderfully. They're very light in colour, but incredibly full of flavour, but very different from what you expect from a Glenrothes, and a lovely, it's just a lovely piece of archive history, really, to be able to taste these things.
We have a great question from Ben Marnock. Rebecca, do you have many casks from closed distilleries? Would you use those in a blend, or would you keep them on their own for the rarity value? What do you do with all the casks you have in-house?
We do lots of different things with them. So I think everything has to stand on its own merits, if you like. The wonderful thing about being independent is that you can decide what you do. And so every year we get a group of people together to taste the inventory, particularly the Scotch inventory, and say, we don't think these ones are going to last another 20 years. So we've got young whiskies, we've got old whiskies, we've got everything in between. We are looking at a program of we're always looking out for other things. My ears pricked up, Kirstie, when you talked about a 1978 Glen Moray. I thought, oh, well.
Yeah, I want
together there.
Because Glen Moray had peat around that time. Would that be before they switched over to coal or fuel oil for drying in their kilns? Were they still kilning at that time?
At Glen Moray?
Yeah.
I don't think so. It's definitely non-peated. There is nothing in it that's anywhere near smoke.
Hey, we sold a bottle for you, Kirstie.
There we go.
Thanks, Kirstie. Hey, we sold a bottle. Cool. Bill Ricker, second fill bourbon cask Macallan is labeled McClellan's Speyside. Very interesting. And Greg says the Glenrothes is, for me, a remarkable single malt, very subtle and interesting for subtle blended whiskeys.
Yeah.
Ben Marnock says Martiniquaise has been under the radar, which it has been, Kirstie. Where did you guys get 750,000 casks from? Ben thinks you would have already had sourced whiskey already blended for you, and obviously that's not the case. You're getting these from all over Scotland. Let's explain the blending process and how it works for those who are not quite familiar with it.
Okay, for ourselves anyway, At Martiniquaise, we own our own grain distillery, so that's where a lot of the volume comes from in the cask. Our malts we purchase or we swap through reciprocal deals. So in Scotland, all the distillers really kind of act as one big kind of society. You don't really see a lot of competition in the whisky industry until the bottles are on the shelf. At distilleries, everybody will help each other. If something goes down at distillery, you just phone and say, if you get a spare pump, come down and get it. We all kind of get on, socialise together. So what we tend to do is for blends, because you need so many different whiskies in there, for ourselves, we own one malt distillery. So to get the other malts that we need to put into our blends, we trade. So we will say to another distillery, we need 10 casks of, say, McCallum. Yeah, just trying to think of one name there. And they'll come back and say, okay, you can have 10 casks of this if you give us 10 casks of Glen Moray. And it's just through that you will buy the stock you need to actually make your blends. So there's a real, very, very much an industry atmosphere. We're all together in the same boat and everybody's pulling together.
But are you trading new make or are you trading aged casks?
Generally, it'll be new make we trade, and that will go to the other distilleries for warehousing. Or there are occasions where we will trade mature spirit as well. It just depends on what's available in the market at that point in time.
Well, let me ask it this way, because I know that, for instance, Ardbeg, with a couple of the vintage releases they've had in recent years, they were able to buy some casks back that had gone to blenders that weren't being used or that had been used. Have you been able to find casks of old Glen Moray that you were able to buy back, for instance?
At the moment, we've been fortunate enough that the inventory we've kept at Glen Moray, we don't have to look at buying any inventory back. I have previous experience of, yes, people buying casks back of different distilleries to reach what they need for different expressions.
So it's not uncommon if you...
Oh, no.
Because some casks just don't work in a blend after so long a period of time that they've been sitting there, right?
Yeah, totally. The blends aren't just about the flavours of the whiskies, it's also the casks, how long it's been in the cask, what type of cask it's been in. Because a sherry cask will give a totally different flavour to a blend than a bourbon cask. So it's about balancing all of that together. So if you do get, say, 10 casks that are sherry as part of your reciprocal, you might sell them on later on. So there's a lot of trading goes on within the industry.
And Greg says that if either of you need someone to help select casks for your whiskeys, just let him know. Yeah, I'm sure that. I'm sure they'll be calling on that one, Glenn. There's a long line of volunteers ahead of you, I'm sure, to help casks for some of those things, right?
That's what you hear every time you go to a tasting.
Rebecca, who gets the final say at the last drop on a bottling? Is it James? Is it you? Is it Beanie? Is it a committee deal? Who gets
it's a committee deal. We would never bottle anything on one person's say so, because everybody's opinion is equally valid. You know, to go back to the very beginning of this conversation where we say what we put into bottle has to be intrinsically delicious. That's not a decision one person can make on their own. As you both know, one man's poison is another man's paradise. So we try and take a fairly broad assessment of what people think, and it doesn't have to be unanimous, but it has to be a pretty significant majority approval. And generally, that's what we found. Everybody in the team has their favourites for sure, and those will be different. But I think we all align when we feel something is right, and that's quite a nice place to be.
Okay, but who comes up with the tasting notes? Who gets to decide on the tasting notes that go into the brochures with it? Because I was looking through the one for the 1970 Glenrothes casks, and you had a certain whiskey writer whom I won't name, but you also had the distillery tasting notes alongside it. Who writes those up?
It depends. So we have a growing panel of you might call experts. So there's obviously the team, who I don't call experts. We're not Scotch whisky experts, but we have a group of people that we ask to taste, and it will be both whiskey writers. We very often call on people within the Sazerac organization to help us out. And it's also very interesting to get tasting notes from people who are not immersed, if you like, within the Scotch whisky industry. So for example, if you ask someone who is more involved in bourbon or cognac to give their tasting notes, you get a very interesting angle on things. So again, it's about taking quite a broad approach to it and about accessibility. So different people rely on different opinions. As you know, China is very reliant on a certain whiskey writer's opinions, but the same thing doesn't apply in other markets. So I mean, I've written whiskey tasting notes. I wouldn't like to say they're the best, but I think it's a really interesting exercise to go through.
Oh yeah, and Steve Bishore, who is runs the distillery at George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon in Virginia, says great discussion, and of course Steve's into history, and he wants to know what the earliest research you have on women distillers in Scotland. He's aware of the history of Johnny Walker with the family that owned Cardew at one point. But is there any research on this area going back into the 17th or 18th centuries? And I'm not sure about it. I don't know if either of you know anything about it either, but it's we can throw it out there and let's see if our history buffs will know.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't say, but Kirstie, you may know more than I.
Nope, sorry, I don't know this one at all.
Yep, dealing with modern day stuff this way. We'll deal with the history stuff right there. Chris Ratcliffe wants to know, how much inspiration do either of you take from American, Japanese, or other whiskeys?
For me, I like to look at all whiskies in all categories, from anywhere to see what's happening, what the latest trends are, what people are working with. Some of the Japanese whiskies are absolutely fantastic. I'm a big fan of Finnish whiskey. There's lots of lovely whiskies all around the place. And yeah, you can take inspiration from them and maybe come up with some ideas from what you see out there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for me, I think as we broaden our portfolio, the inspiration beyond Scotch and cognac and bourbon is just absolutely waiting to be explored. We've got our first rum coming out later this year, which is a super exciting thing for us. It's been many years since we were seeking one, but I also think, for example, what they're doing down in India is just so interesting at the Paul John Distillery and others in India. The whiskies they're making are absolutely fantastic. The way that they are working with their environment and the huge levels of heat and atmosphere is just so interesting, and the lessons they're learning from Scotch, if you like, and what they're doing with those is just super interesting.
And Greg Serafian points out Bessie Williamson at Lefroy, but that was in the last century. So Steve was talking 17th to 18th centuries as opposed to the 19th century. But let's and Steve says he has some work to do then. Question for Kirstie: is there likely to be a single grain release from Starlaw? What is Starlaw? Does that ring a bell to you?
Oh yes, Starlaw is our grain distillery in Bathgate, just in between Glasgow and Edinburgh. It's where I'm based. My head office is at Starlaw. At the moment, there actually has been a launch of Starlaw. There is a 5-year-old Label 5 bourbon cask, which is Starlaw grain. I'm looking to do something more with Starlaw because I think there's a great opportunity with it. It's a lovely spirit. We have some beautiful casks laid down. So again, it's another one. I've got so many plans since I've just started. I just need a little bit of time to put them into action.
Well, with that, I think it's about time to call it an evening. And I want to thank both of you for a lot of insights, a lot of conversation, and a lot of good whiskeys over the years that you guys have been making them. Rebecca, please give our best to James, Beanie, and everybody on your team. Same to everybody at your shop as well. And hang on just a second here while I say goodbye to everybody. Once again, don't forget to join us on Friday night. Robin Lang, who is arguably probably the best singer and songwriter in Scotland when it comes to whiskey. You've probably heard his songs over the years. And Richard Woodard will be among our guests on the Friday Happy Hour show. And we'll be back next Wednesday with another Whiskey Wednesday webcast. Don't forget to join us for the WhiskyCast podcast this coming weekend. And you can also listen to this week's episode with the one and only Fred No of Jim Beam, talking about being cooped up in his house during the coronavirus pandemic. And if you've ever seen Fred in person, you know that Fred pacing the cage is probably a really interesting picture to watch right now. Thanks again for watching, and until we meet again, I'm Mark Gillespie. Good night, everyone.